The private presses are in many ways a continuation of the old style printing movement. But of course the figure of William Morris comes into them too, and this tended to change everything. He created what he called the Kelmscott Press, of which you see the mark here. Kelmscott was this manor house a long way from London, with which he fell in love. Simple vernacular building of the Middle Ages, and which he used as an illustration in his News from Nowhere, one of the most, I think, moving of his fiction works. We have images of Morris taken by his friend Emery Walker, about whom we'll say something in a moment. Here he is dressed in rather simple clothing, a blue denim shirt with no tie. And the images of his wife Jane are familiar, also the work of Emery Walker. Morris got drawn into the whole world of craftsmanship, of making things by hand, and it's not really the purpose of this talk to examine that in huge detail. But this, in a way, will be quite a good introduction. He revived fabric printing using traditional dyes, not the masterpieces of chemical theory that were realized as the new colours, the new dyes of the 19th century, but using traditional plant-based colours, and in this case printed on a good linen fabric. In a way, the same attitude went to his experiments with writing. Here in the 1870s, he's trying calligraphy. And as you can see from the three last lines, he had the writing book of Vicentino as a model to copy. When it came to printing his own writing, he got interested in influencing that. Here, in the late 1880s, you have one of his Nordic sagas. It's a prose work, by the way, but it includes poems by him. He wrote one to fill in that gap on the title page, as he explained to a rather shocked friend. And here on the right you've got one of the bits of poetry in the text. The whole of the text was set using the rather rugged Basel type that had been made for the Chiswick Press in the 1850s. And in many ways it suits Morris's verse rather well. But the idea of a press of his own was stimulated, as we know, by a lecture given by Emery Walker with lantern slides of early types, which gave him the idea of making his own press and types to go with it. And this was his explanation of his attitude to making type. Not compressed laterally, as later type has grown to be, as we saw. And so he chose the Jensen type as the model for his own, getting it photographed to a big scale, and then drawing it, and finally handing it to a punch cutter to realize it in metal. That is the type that he made, the so-called golden type, cut by Prince, but essentially realizing his own rather rugged instinct for what a Roman type should be. Just a brief word about Walker. He was what was known as a process engraver. That is, he made images for printing entirely photographically. And his work is very much something that ought to be, I think, documented well. Here, for example, you've got in the great 11th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica a map of Germany, produced entirely photographically, with thousands of place names set in type, and then 3 colours used to print them in relief by letterpress. That's something that needs investigating, I think, and documenting. And late in his life, he became particularly interested in reproducing photographs by an intaglio process. And this is an example continued by his firm under the name of Emery Walker Limited. So that is gravure. This is one of the images that Walker made for Morris, a 5 times enlargement taken from a page printed by Jacobus Robeus, but using Jensen's type in the 1470s. And instantly you can see the match with the golden type we've just looked at. And that is what Morris made of the photograph. So there you see the two together. And Morris remarked that he thinks his type has rather more Gothic in it than Jensen's. Well, compare the two and you can see what he means. And so the Kelmscott Press began printing texts that were particularly the favourites of Morris. The Golden Legend that had been printed by Caxton gave its name to the golden type that you see in use here, with woodcut ornaments done after drawings by Morris himself, and a rather fine Gothic used as the words of the title. That is, in effect, the title page. And being Morris, he wanted a Gothic type, and that's what he made, the so-called Troy type. Surprisingly legible, and used for a number of the books printed at the press. Chaucer was one of his great loves, and here's an image that's often reproduced showing the title page spread of this big folio volume with an illustration by his friend Burne-Jones, almost crushed by the sheer weight of the ornament surrounding it. It was a considerable achievement to print it at all on a hand press, but there you see it being printed on this massive 19th century iron Albion press. That's an opening which I've never seen reproduced, but this is the text. In fact, of course, the works of Chaucer were so long that a special small size of the Gothic type had to be cut following the Troy type. And there it is. Quite legible if you care to handle a big, heavy folio. And the binding, typically for Morris, is a massive version of the binding of an early printed book, white pigskin, which is about as durable a book cover as you can ever get. I suppose, to be fair, I ought to show the one cheap book that his press ever did. This was printed at one of the exhibitions of the Arts and Crafts Society, and was sold for 2 shillings and sixpence. So affordable compared with some of the other books. They're printed on handmade paper. They're printed in the types Morris designed. And in a sense, part of their spirit can be got from this note which is inside one of the Morris books. Trim the edges of the leaves, don't cut them. In the case of Bodoni, this was to keep the margins. In a way, this is part of the thinking of Morris. He wanted to keep the margins he had planned. But it was also because it would destroy the impression of the type, and that would injure the appearance of the printing. Well, there's another influence going on here. One of the books he printed was a chapter from a book written by John Ruskin in the 1850s. And as he says, it was one of the most important things that Ruskin wrote. And so we have Ruskin's views of the proper following of designs by the craftsman. Never encourage the manufacture of any article in which invention has no share. Never designed an exact finish for its own sake, but only for some practical or noble end. So the hefty presswork of the Kelmscott Press, to some extent, is justified by these words of Ruskin's. And as Ruskin says, Venetian glass is made by hand, and we never see the same form in it twice. If the workman is thinking about his edges, he cannot be thinking of his design. Choose whether you will make the worker a man or a grindstone. Well, that's political speaking, and Morris acted out his own ideas in his own life and his designs. In a way, the following of the books of the private press movement, as it became, could hardly be more different. St. John Hornby was, in a sense, a maker of books. He took a chain of book stalls, booksellers in financial difficulties, and made it into the massive chain of W.H. Smith. For relaxation, he did his own printing, and he took a type that Morris had been interested in, the Subiaco type of Schönheim and Panart's of the 1460s. It was a type that Morris had thought about making, and here is the result made for St. John Hornby. Is it just a bit too perfect? I think so. But it does have a hand-drawn initial. Morris never got round to doing that. Walker had been invited to take part in the Kelmscott Press, and very sensibly thought that there was not room for 2 people in running a press of that kind. But then he set up his own press after Morris had died, the Dobbs Press, called after the Dobbs public house next to where he lived. It's a Jensen type. Very, very elegantly done, using his own photographs, of course. Is it just a bit too smooth? Well, that press ended in disaster, as everyone knows. Unwisely, he did have a partner, Cobden Sanderson, who got a bit protective and decided that the type was something he had an interest in. And of course this is the font that got thrown into the Thames at Hammersmith Bridge. Well, there we are. Was there any point in reprinting a standard text like that of Milton? It's a question one has to ask. Two other presses worth glancing at. Pissarro was from a family of French painters who came to live in England and was caught up in the idea of the private press. But his Iranye press, as you can tell from the binding, had other models in its sight. That's a Japanese binding, and the colour woodcuts too have more than something of the Japanese model behind them. Very beautiful books. In a way, one of the more interesting of the private presses was that made for Harry Count Kessler, German by birth, but very strong lover of English culture. And in this case, he used some woodcuts that had been made by Edward Gordon Craig as figures for a model theatre. This is part of the new world of theatre of the early 20th century. They weren't intended to print from, and they are on the side grain of the wood. And the printer has caught that texture of the side grain, which is in fact exploited in another woodcut used at the Cranach press, as it was called, the Cranach Presse. In this case, you can see the grain of the side grain of the wood, and the two chief figures are picked out by a denser, heavier impression done by varying the make-ready on the hand press. I'm not sure how legitimate that is, but it certainly works in this case. Well, there we are. I'm not going to pursue the question of the private presses. They clearly stem from the revival of the early types, which took place in the books made for William Pickering. But here to finish off is the Oxford Fell type being used by a certain Francis Mennell, to whom these types were given, and the ornaments too. He later made a series of books under the imprint of the Nonsuch Press, which had no press at all of its own. But he could handle type, and so we'll finish with this example, printed in his own dining room in 1917.